right, so today we're going to be talking about how is China being weakened from within. So we already see the tactics that the British used to gain control of India. We already talked in class about the tactics the British were using in China as far as the Opium War and how they're using opium as a tool to gain control in China. Today we're going to talk about what actually is going on in China itself politically, and then in class we're going to be doing a couple of readings kind of showing some of the major issues that are going to eventually bring about the downfall of the Qin dynasty, or the last empire of China. So the first question that we have, and some of this may be familiar to those of you who did this for your that you're working on this for your comparative essay, is how did the Taiping Rebellion expose discontent within the Qin dynasty? So by the 1800s, we could say in general, the Qin Empire was an empire that was in decline. Irrigation and canals were needing repair. Peasants were being pushed off of their land. There was massive flooding and famine, and the government really wasn't doing much to protect the people. The government was becoming very corrupt, and the taxes were very high. So these are kind of the things that are pushing the Qin people towards a rebellion. And the rebellion that's going to occur is going to be led not by this man. This is the guy that's going to actually really fight against the rebellion. But the rebellion is going to be led by a man by the name of Han Shi. So he's going to be the leader of the Taiping Rebellion. This guy here, Zheng Guofan, he is going to be the author of one of the readings that we are going to be doing in class called The Plight of the Emperor's Subjects. And we're really going to get to see what are some of the major issues that China is facing. But in general, Han Shi was inspired by religious visions. He wanted to create what he referred to as a heavenly kingdom of peace. Now, the Taiping Rebellion is going to last from 1850 until 1864. Now, Han Shi was a failed examination candidate, so he tried to take the civil service exams and tried to enter into government service in China, but failed. He thought he was the younger brother of Jesus, sent by God to find a new kingdom on earth. His followers believed that he could walk on air, and he would go into these ecstatic trances as if like God was speaking to him, and he denounced the Manchus as the creatures of Satan. Now, like I said before, this becomes a really widespread, large rebellion. You might say, well, why were all these people listening to him if he was kind of a little bit of a wackadoo? But some of the things that he was standing up for were very appealing to the Chinese people because of all the issues that were going on, which we're going to see in more detail when we do the readings in class. But some of the things that he wanted to do is he wanted to abolish private property, and this was a major issue because there was such inequality of land wealth within China at this point. He wanted to create communal wealth. He wanted to prohibit foot binding, so he was for more rights for women in general. He believed in equality of men and women. He also wanted to end the practice of what's called concubinage. I'll spell the word. Now, a concubine is kind of considered like a lesser wife or a mistress. She's not quite a prostitute, but she's kind of looked down upon in society. And it's kind of a way to kind of keep women down in some ways. So he wanted to get rid of this whole system of concubinage. He wanted to get rid of foot binding. He wanted equality of men and women. And he wanted free public education for all. And as you know, for China, education was the key to kind of advancement and was considered very highly valued and coveted. So the fact that he wanted to provide that to everyone also made his message very appealing to the people. So now I have some images I'm going to show you that are kind of funny. I have no idea where these people come up with these things, but they're little figurines of the Taiping Rebellion that I don't know why people are obsessed with doing. But if you Google stuff on the internet, you find all sorts of things like this. So there's Han Shi, and there are the Taipings, and there are more of the Taipings fighting. And this rebellion got really out of hand, especially the government really was not in a position to take this rebellion down. It lasted for years. Millions of people died, like 20 million people died from this rebellion. And the Chinese, during this time period, if you remember, because of the Treaty of Nanjing, which ended the Opium War, the Chinese were required to pay very large indemnities to the British. And they were unable to pay this indemnity while they have a decade-long massive rebellion going on. So the British came in, sending in with them their sepoys to help put down the rebellion in order to be able to make sure that they are collecting their money, as did the French. Also sent troops in to help put down the Taiping Rebellion to ensure their access to Chinese goods and trade. So the next question then is, how did the Taiping Rebellion really impact China? So the Taipings wound up taking control of Nanjing. Nanjing at the time was the capital. It's spelled Nanjing, or sometimes it's spelled Nan King, but it was the capital of China. The treaty that ends the Opium War, if you remember, is referred to as the Treaty of Nanjing. But the Taipings actually captured and controlled the capital city of Nanjing for a decade. The Taiping rebellions weren't just the only rebellions that were present in China. Other rebellions began to break out because of the disorder. So in the 1850s, we see a whole bunch of different rebellions break out. So these rebels would pass through towns. Sometimes the whole town and village would say, this is a cool message and we believe in it and we're going to stand up and fight with you too. Or in some instances, they were forced to join in with the rebellion. Like I said before, Britain and France attacked China again, which is sometimes referred to as the Second Opium War. And that was done to make sure they could get their reparations. And all said and done, 20 to 30 million people died in this rebellion from starvation and disease. So this is a huge, huge number of people, on par with like the World Wars. The Taipings would come in and surround the fortified cities and see if they were willing to join them. And if they weren't willing to join in with them, they would wait for the people to starve. People were eating things like grass and leather. They resorted to cannibalism because the famines that resulted in this got so bad. Huge, massive amounts of disease broke out because the dead weren't being properly buried. There was an outbreak of the bubonic plague. Agriculture was completely devastated, and whole parts of central and eastern China were completely depopulated as a result of this rebellion. So, as a result, this led to a great deal of calls for reform in China. Now, what's going to happen is the Europeans are going to pounce on this weakness that they see available in China. And what's ultimately going to happen to China is China's going to be divided up into what are referred to as spheres of influence. So if we look on this map, we can see the French, the British, the Germans, the Japanese, and the Russians all had a sphere of influence. Now, the fact that the Japanese have a sphere of influence shows you how far China falls, because they had always been kind of the dominant power in the region, and Japan would have been bowing to China's will, not the other way around. But in these spheres of influence, and if you take note of just the areas that the British are controlling in their sphere of influence, they of course have the Yangtze River, which was one of the major rivers in China, large areas of fertile land, and then of course they have this area right here, which is on the border of their other colony, India, so it makes the most sense for them. The French, you can see, gain this area here in southern China, and that's also really convenient for them because Vietnam, which was referred to as Indochina, Laos, also were all French colonies, so it made it easier for the French to gain access to their other colonies. Hong Kong, which is over here, is a port that belongs to the British, though. So basically, in these spheres of influence, the Chinese were still politically controlling the area, but the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, the Japanese, they had complete economic control in those areas. So it was almost like China had multiple mother countries, rather than like India just had to deal with Britain. China had to deal with all these other various different mother countries, trying to figure out ways to exploit China the best they could and make the most money from China as they could. So as a result, there was an attempt by the Chinese themselves to stop this whole system. And that becomes a movement known as the self-strengthening. It'd be good if I could spell strengthening. Nope. hold on, sorry, movements. And the self-strengthening movement goes from 1860 until 1895. And what the idea was, they were going to try to promote military and economic reform, because a lot of the Chinese in the government, especially the emperor, realized that this was not going well for China. And they wanted to have Chinese learning at the base and Western learning for use. Kind of like what we're going to see that the Japanese do very well. The Japanese are able to implement this concept very, very well. They take on the ideas of the West, but they keep true to their traditional cultures and learning. And this is what the Chinese tried to do within the self-strengthening movement. The issue was, for the Chinese, is that there was a struggle. That's where we have this question here, these problems, the reforms in China. There was a struggle within the Chinese government. On one side, you have the Dowager Empress, who is this woman here in the middle. And her name, I can never pronounce it. I'm sure I massacre it. Her name is, I believe I always mispronounce it, but that's the Dowager Empress. Dowager means that she was like the former empress, and then her nephew takes control as emperor. Her nephew's name was did I spell that wrong? No, I didn't. Guangzhou. He was the emperor. She was the Dowager Empress. So what happened is there's a power struggle that goes on between these two groups. She was very conservative, and her power base was amongst the Confucian scholars. And the Confucian scholars really did not want to see changes happen in China. Whereas the emperor very much saw the need for change and was interested in changing many things in China. He launches something in 1898 that's referred to as the 100 Days of Reform. And what he wanted to do with the 100 Days of Reform was reform the lands, and so kind of get rid of this inequalities between the lands, have a constitutional monarchy with civil liberties. So he was even willing to forfeit some of his power as emperor. He wanted to reform the education. He wanted to modernize the military, and he wanted to stimulate the economy. And the Dowager Empress kind of stands up and kind of stops this with her base of support. She actually, for a time, imprisoned the emperor, and she had many of the reformers executed. Now, some of her reasons why she, throughout history, has been kind of vilified is she was seen as kind of not focusing on what China actually needed. So while China's going through all these issues and paying off all these reparations, a lot of the money that China is collecting in taxes, rather than being used to kind of improve China's economy, is being used to like improve the imperial grounds. This is something called the Summer Palace. This is actually her quarters within the Summer Palace outside of Beijing. And the Summer Palace was not like what we would think of palaces here. It was like a huge park complex. It was very beautifully decorated, as you can see. There's a picture of me in the Summer Palace. There's this huge covered walkway that goes through it. There's all sorts of like buildings and complexes. You can see another image of this. There you go. There's a man-made lake. So this lake was dug out by hand, and money was diverted for the Dowager Empress to have this marble boat built, which she kind of used, which obviously wasn't a useful boat since it couldn't go anywhere because it was made out of marble. But money that should have been going to reforms were going to building things like this palace, building things like these marble boats. And in the Opium War, this palace got burned down. The Chinese rebuilt it. It got burned down again. The Chinese rebuilt it again. Now, another thing that's significant to note, because ultimately China is going to be divided up into these spheres of influences, is the city of Shanghai. Shanghai is in southern China on the Yangtze River, and Shanghai was kind of divided up into multiple spheres of influence. So each European country that had power in China kind of had a section of Shanghai. I was kind of talking about this when I was talking about India, how the British would kind of recreate little British villages within India so they felt at home. So if you look in Shanghai, this is along the Yangtze River in an area called the Bund, and it's all European architecture. Here's the the Shanghai South Railway Station. Notice this is also the only place I saw in China when I was there where things were actually translated into English. Everything was always just exclusively in Chinese. But you can see the architecture of the city. It's even the title of the building, Da Vinci, is not your typical Chinese. It felt like suddenly when you went to Shanghai that you had stepped out of China. I remember coming out of the subway and being like, wow, I'm not in China anymore, because it's so different than the architecture from the other cities I had been to in China. And this is actually the section called the French Concession. So this was like the French area of the city. And they even imported trees from France to make it look more like France. So we can see that China is basically being just completely dominated by the West. And this is a very famous political cartoon with the whole idea of imperialism. And you see all the various different European powers just kind of carving up China. So this is Britain and Queen Victoria. So that's Queen Victoria. This guy with the crazy hat, that's the Germans. The Germans, their military had kind of funny looking hats on. Here is the Japanese, this is the French, and this is the Russians. And they're all sitting there carving up their piece of China while the Chinese are kind of trying to stop it but are completely powerless to do so because they've just been so battered down by the Europeans. So the question then becomes is, could the problems of China have been fixed? Could the Chinese have kind of prevented themselves from being carved up like we see here? And this is what we're going to continue to talk about when we talk about how the Chinese Empire comes to an end and the reforms that China tries to make to try to change their country.